stop to think that whilst it's great to see Mercedes at the front again and yet another competitive team, that there is another problem that they have to consider. That they are this close to emulating what happened when Williams dropped the GOAT and Logan was in his place.
In short, I think Toto might have actually realised he almost did an oopsie.
If Wolff isn't careful, the rushing in of Kimi Antonelli into the same car as George Russell for next year might end up being an extremely costly mistake. Not just the future of Kimi Antonelli as a racing driver, but also the future of Toto Wolff as a team principal. It's been quite clear that this seems to be almost a last Hail Mary of Toto to try and make Mercedes competitive again, and if it didn't work out, he probably would have maybe gotten them this bit closer to retirement. But now, it doesn't seem that much of a worry right at the moment, because Mercedes, they've been doing really well lately. This is something that's been a bit of a hot-button topic in the last few months, ever since Lewis made the call to jump for Ferrari. There have been many drivers considered, some more logical than others, but the idea of Antonelli making it to Mercedes one day was a plausible outcome. You know, in 2026, at the earliest, once he's had a couple of years in F2, not just the 1 year. But maybe the idea of bringing him in next year might not have been so bad, considering what was going on with the W15, how it was a tricky car to set up, it had problems with cooling, it was 4th in the Constructors, possibly even 5th if Aston Martin's trend from last year continued and they proved to be better than Mercedes than most teams. Being in the second Mercedes seat alongside George wasn't maybe as enticing for other drivers. This of course leading Toto to mention that he could do something drastic. And no, I'm not talking about the whole thing about bringing in Max Verstappen to partner George Russell, because that thing will just simply not go away. But the idea of rushing the young Italian junior driver into F1, akin to the rapid ascension of Max, aka the one that Toto let slip through his fingers because his pathway to F1 was simply too long and winding for him. So yeah, at that point, with Mercedes completely floundering, really realising that they've made a fundamental era with this era of Formula 1, then maybe if you just stick in Kimi Antonelli for 2025, if Mercedes aren't going to figure at the top, let him figure out what the sport's all about without too much attention. It's a fair idea, it's a decent one, it's respectable, but in my honest opinion, it would have been too soon. Had Mercedes remained in the midfield, at the top of the midfield. And now they're back in the front-running pack and potentially going for wins and podiums and maybe the Constructors' title in 2025, it would be definitely too soon. Even amongst my viewership, it's a somewhat split decision, with a poll I conducted on Twitter being effectively torn as to what Mercedes should do with Antonelli for 2025. Some people saying that yes, he should be promoted, others say no. Maybe some people saying that they should do what George Russell did with Williams, learning his tricks of the trade there, him being locked in a 3-year deal before he then made the leap toward Mercedes. Granted, this is just one tiny little poll on the internet, but it really does bring up a question at this point with Mercedes: what do you do with Kimi Antonelli? Because right now, Toto and Mercedes are looking at their best junior driver they've had in years and realising that, oh, okay, these results aren't exactly what we hoped for. This is not a barnstorming performance that we saw in Formula Regional or in Formula 4. This is proving to be somewhat, I don't want to say bad, more like average, okay, decent. Kimi has been consistent, but at the same time, he's been consistently lackluster. But that is mainly down to the fact, because Oliver Behrman's dealing with the same situation, that Prema have really not figured themselves out with these brand new Formula 2 cars. Neither have many other teams, considering how much the car has proven to be unreliable. Its clutch issues have come back again, like the 2018 cars had when they were new. It's an ongoing trend that there are some teething problems with brand new F2 cars. In Kimi's defence, he is doing alright. He did get a sprint race win in Silverstone, just miles away from the Brackley facility. But there are other rookies in F2 this year which are proving more notable than Antonelli. Like Paul Aaron, for example, who led the championship until recently because of his consistency. And you want to know a kicker to all of that? Is that Paul Aaron used to be a Mercedes junior driver. And now he's outperforming the star that Toto's pinning all of his hopes on. Because they parted ways in November, so Paul Aaron's now a free agent. So I bet Mercedes are regretting, parting company with him. Because quite frankly, Paul Aaron is a more likely F1 candidate at the moment. So even though logic is in the favour of Aaron, unfortunately for the Estonian, his results aren't exactly headline-grabbing when compared to Antonelli, because he's had no real championships to his name as of late, but plenty of seconds and thirds, so he's been competitive, just not quite enough to be on the top step. And I imagine that Mercedes needed their own youngster to emulate Verstappen, and Paul simply wasn't it. He was competent, yes, dependable, but when it comes to results and being exciting and engaging, Paul sadly wasn't it. But you know what? Sometimes boring and competent gets you results. Sometimes being boring and competent is what you need. And I think Estonia needed a driver who wasn't going to throw their career down the toilet because they said something that they really shouldn't have. I'm looking at you, Vips. What's becoming quite clear is that Mercedes is regaining its footing, and its slow and steady upgrade path is proving to be performing more effective rather than in huge packages, which only McLaren seem to be making work presently and consistently. And honestly, I wish to spare as much pain from Ferrari fans as possible right now. Toto is now on the front foot again. He's now reliving the old days, in that they can develop a part, they can put it on the car, and it will produce results, because that's what they were able to do back in the day when there was no cost cap. They could just go, oh, exactly, I want to make sure the car goes faster. Hey, you design a part, make it happen, put it on the car, and then it goes vroom vroom much faster. Ah, yeah, excellent, excellent. You see, now they finally got the hang of it in the cost cap era. They can't throw money at the problem, but what they are throwing at the problem seems to work. And what this has resulted in is that in the triple header, Mercedes have actually been one of the most competitive teams in the hunt for the title. This is actually kind of satisfying, because seeing Mercedes not at the front after their domination era is just weird. It's felt like a bit like the wilderness years of Red Bull in 2014 and 15. They were not competitive at all, and it just didn't seem right after all the success that they had had with Vettel. This isn't me being biased toward Mercedes, this isn't my jam, I'm not a Mercedes fan, but I do like to see multiple teams right at the front challenging for wins. I know, I want McLaren to win all the time, but at the same time, I want to have a good show. And right now, we are seeing 2024 transform itself into a slightly more diluted facsimile of 2012, where you have so many winners of so many Grand Prix. And I bet Max Verstappen is really grateful for the fact that Red Bull got it so right at the beginning of the year, and he got so many wins, which has resulted in him having an 80+ point gap to Lando Norris. Because right now, if you took all the races before Miami out of the equation, it'd be incredibly close as to who is actually leading the championship. Those first 4 races were absolute gold dust for Max. This could prove crucial in case Red Bull continued to stagnate, but don't discount Max from still being up there, able to at least minimise the erosion in his championship lead. At least. He's probably still going to win the title by about 100 points anyway. And this is actually making me realise something, that maybe the model of having one strong driver and one backup in case things go wrong and they have to pick up the pieces, that's now starting to become somewhat extinct. That it's no longer trendy, and that having 2 strong drivers might be the way to go. In a world when Mercedes are now competitive again, and 2025 could prove to be even more fruitful for them alongside McLaren, Ferrari, well, I mean, if they can get their act together, because they've now got an undrivable car when they did have a drivable car, what Red Bull have established in terms of driver models, it will become impractical. With 4 teams now going for podiums and wins, you can't do that anymore, because otherwise it's going to compromise you if another team does have 2 strong drivers or drivers close in skill to one another. What we're seeing right now at Red Bull is how the one driver model is working wonders for Max, but it's leading to the team itself being rapidly gobbled up by its rivals because Checo is suffering terribly with the car being developed away from him, or their side of the garage not working as effectively as Max's. Whilst Red Bull have been dominant, it didn't really matter as much, and therefore people were looking to Red Bull and thinking, well, how on earth are they being so successful? Oh, I know, it's because they're prioritising one driver and making sure that they can perform at the best of their ability to the detriment of the second driver. Well, that's exactly what we're going to try and do, because we want to try and get that driver's title or the constructors. Well, that ain't working, chummy. Because right now, what we're seeing is that Christian Horner's model of just prioritising Max is not working anymore, because it will lose the constructor's title, will lose prize money, and if they then chuck Checo, they're probably going to be losing a whole buttload of money. And that means the balance of Red Bull for 2025, or even next year after that, might be considerably lower than it was in 2023. Contrast that to their rivals, where their drivers are proving to be relatively close in skill to one another, and no real leader is being established because it ebbs and flows. Granted, in the case of Leclerc, it's down to a bout of unreliability, mistakes with pit stops and rotten luck, and with Hamilton, it's been down to the car simply not working the way he wanted it to until now. It still allowed these teams to be contenders for the Constructors' title, rather than for Red Bull to romp away with it. Then we get back to the matter of Kimi Antonelli. Can you see where I'm getting at here? Is that, yeah, it'd be great to see him in Formula 1 in terms of excitement and unpredictability, but when it's coming for the Constructors' push and you need 2 strong drivers who are experienced, having Kimi there is a bit of an unknown. He might prove to be fantastic. The F1 car might suit him down to the ground, but right now it's looking really precarious, and Toto really wants to get some meaningful silverware before the new regulation cycle comes in to prove that they can fix things, and this was just a temporary blip, because right now it just proves that Mercedes really got the ground effect era of Formula 1 cars wrong, so they want to get some sort of vindication. Kimi does deserve to be in F1 at some point, but not next year. But then again, most people tend to see this as an inevitability rather than an opportunity. Yes, we're all looking for the next Max Verstappen, a youngster ready to rise through the ranks in rapid succession and completely blow apart the status quo. But that isn't going to happen. And that's not just down to Helmut Marko saying that looking for the next Max Verstappen is fruitless and that they're not even trying to do that anymore, but it's down to all the stuff that's come after Max Verstappen got in Formula 1. All the rules, the red tape, preventing a protege 16-year-old driver getting into Formula 1 because they were showing good results in karting or in Formula 3. That's been curtailed, it's been slowed down, it's only been diluted slightly because of Kimi Antonelli, that you can consider exceptional 17-year-olds, but even then, there is a condition. Is it down to their own protection, or is it down to the fact that, well, Verstappen just disrupted things and they didn't want to be disrupted again? As well as the fact that there are far fewer places in Formula 1 for brand new drivers to get in because the current existing drivers, including the old ones, are proven to be much more marketable, social media savvy, and popular than the drivers of even a decade ago, where social media was really in its infancy in motorsport, and in terms of Formula 1, it was abysmal or non-existent because Bernie Ecclestone didn't really see much of the point of it. Can you remember social media and Twitter and all that stuff with Formula 1 in 2014-15? It was atrocious. There was nothing there, really. It just felt like an anachronism. It does seem that Mercedes are beginning to understand this, that their push for Kimi Antonelli into Formula 1 was a little bit misguided and probably has had some sort of detrimental effect on the Italian. That maybe their drastic action of February or March proved to be that little bit too drastic, because they've been really keen in walking back the automatic promotion idea of the Italian and instead feel the need to swim in F2 for a little while longer. Here's what Toto has to say, and don't worry, I won't do the accent because it will just get boring. Ahem. I've always said that we need a car that goes quick, and when we have a car that goes quick, we put the driver in and we get interesting for many drivers. But in a way, I think we need to stay calm and continue the season, continue to focus on the car, and then look at whether the options are still the same. But it's not like winning races is changing everything and turning the situation upside down. But seeing him on Saturday, walking over the water at times 2 seconds quicker than everybody else, you can see the talent and the ability and the potential this young guy has. Winning that race, I think, took a lot of weight off of his shoulders. Thank goodness. He is recognising that Kimi has had a lot of issues in 2024 to overcome, but that getting the sprint win has yielded some meaningful headlines and shown that he can win in Formula 2, and not to mention that once again, other drivers are suddenly interested in Mercedes again, after the last couple of months have proven that many drivers are not that interested anymore, Fernando Alonso completely making fun of them, trolling them in a way with his Aston Martin acquisition, and then at the same time, Mercedes and Toto snubbing Carlos Sainz say they weren't on his radar right now. And speaking of Carlos, this could ultimately justify the reason why he's delayed in trying to find a place in Formula 1 for next year. Yes, it has been frustrating to see Sainz dawdle, but let's be fair to him. The revelation of him being replaced at Ferrari happened a lot earlier than it usually would. Usually it happens around about this time of year, or at most in September, not back in February. So it feels a lot longer than it actually has been, so I really have to catch myself when I get frustrated with Carlos. And now Toto's acknowledged that he's been responsible for Kimi feeling pressured. So this could mean that he doesn't succumb to what has happened to Logan Sargeant in F1, the American driver being rushed into F1 a year earlier than planned, if at all. It was simply down to the fact that Jost Capito no longer saw Nicholas Latifi as a viable candidate for Formula 1 in 2023. It was obvious that the Canadian was not suited to the ground effect era of Formula 1 cars at all. Not to mention all of the blowback after 2021, which probably dented his confidence even more. So, one of Jost's last acts before he then quit the team was to rush the Williams reserve into the seat, instead of possibly a debut in 2024. As a result, Sargeant's been the subject of intense scrutiny, drowned with a car that was not rookie-friendly, and a team which is going through a major overhaul, and this was with Williams. Can you imagine what would happen if Kimi was going through all of this at Mercedes? Oh wait, no, we don't actually need to, we're already seeing it in living colour before he's even turned a wheel in a Grand Prix, or even done an FP1 session for Mercedes. I get it, Toto, you want to have the next Verstappen. If you can't get Max Verstappen and try and correct the mistake of 2013 and 14, then you've got one already, a young Italian. But you really have to be careful with this, or else you're going to end up with the next Logan Sargeant. And I know it pains me to use Logan as a comparison, but the fact is, though, he is a comparison through no fault of his own, because any young driver, when given the chance of getting into Formula 1, especially these days, you take it with both arms. Because when you look back at his junior career, it's been solid. He went toe-to-toe with Oscar Piastri on occasion in F3, and then he completely sunk in F1 when thrust into it. What Antonelli needs to go through next year is another season in F2 not as a rookie, so that Prema can deliver a setup and workflow that works better with the Italian and the new machinery, to truly showcase his potential and what he's learnt throughout his first season. So that means he can be ready for when the new regulations come in, whether it's at Williams or at Mercedes. It really depends, because I did feel that really odd that he'd be getting into Formula 1 in 2025, and then bam, there's a rule change, and the F1 cars completely change again. So maybe it might be best for Kimi just to wait out 2025, do extensive work in the simulator for the 2026 car because development resumes again. He can be one of their lead drivers in that department, and then he'll be fully kitted out, used to the idea of the new cars, and then he can go from there. Instead, he'll be playing double duty of sorts, learning one type of car and learning another type of car as a rookie. It's a little bit of a tricky balancing act in a way. And then, oh yeah, he's got to try and go and make sure that Mercedes win the Constructors. Good luck, Kimi! Because for 2025, Mercedes do need a strong lineup in which to mount a challenge for both titles and maximise their aggressive development, because it really looks a lot less guaranteed Red Bull next year. Because looking at the situation right now with Red Bull, they're not going to be taking any risky gambles when it comes to their driver lineup. Checo's probably going to be retained for another year because Liam Lawson didn't do quite as well as was expected in terms of benchmark time, supposedly. Yuki Tsunoda has been constantly ignored by Christian Horner, although he has said that maybe you never know, but I think we all know, because Daniel's probably going to get it. Daniel's not quite as good as he used to be back in 2018. He'll toe the line, he'll be okay, but we don't know that. It's so uncertain with Daniel at the moment. He has his highs, he has his lows. It's almost as unpredictable as it is with Checo right now. Toto cannot do what he originally wanted to do and stick Kimi in the W16 and think that he could learn quietly in the background, because nobody would care about Mercedes, because they're fending off the midfield and rediscovering themselves, because, well, they've rediscovered themselves now, or at least for now. And if Toto decides to wait a year or two for Kimi, then this is great news for Carlos Sainz. It would make the wait worthwhile, and it would also be pretty good news for George as well, because if it turned out that Kimi really settled into Formula 1 quite nicely, and he completely wiped the floor, or was a lot closer to George than anyone would have thought, it would have been, from the other point of view, George seeing what happened with Bottas in 2020 when he subbed in for Lewis at Sakhir, being a lot closer than expected to Valtteri, because he'd been in that car for many years and throughout the entire season with the W11. It would have been a bit of a wake-up call for George, but now he might be spared that, or at least for a year or two more. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Carlos will make it easy for him, because right now, Carlos is trying to prove to everybody that he is a good driver, and he is racing for himself at Ferrari. He is really sort of going against the grain of what the Scuderia is expecting, and actually, it's actually giving them some hope. He's provided them something in terms of points or meaningful results, sure. At best, it's like 5th, but if Carlos were not really performing as well as expected and driving the nuts out of that car, it could be even worse, because their average points tally in the last few races have been atrocious. Aston Martin have almost scored more points on average recently than Ferrari. Hülkenberg has scored more than Leclerc. It's that bad. But at the same time, with Kimi there, and hopefully if he's kept in F2 for a little longer and Carlos subs in for a year or two, then if Toto thinks there are any ideas that Carlos might try to usurp the team order, or maybe give George a little bit too much hassle than he would like, then maybe Kimi could be used as some sort of threat, almost. This is the case for George as well, because if George and Carlos start to bicker as to who's going to lead the team, then Toto could easily just whack him on the head and go, if either of you start to bicker and actually cost us points in the championship, then Kimi is right there and he could replace either one of you. Of course, it depends if Antonelli has a better sophomore year in F2 than his rookie year, otherwise that would be a bit of a toothless threat, but him being there might be enough to maybe temper this potential lineup of Sainz and Russell. Ultimately, Toto is in a better place than he was at the beginning of this year. He has Kimi Antonelli. He is locked in a contract. He will be in Mercedes eventually, either if George moves on to another team to try and get better results, or they drop George, or if they can't get Max, and Carlos is only there for a couple of years before he moves on to another team that turns out to do really well in the brand new regulation cycle. You don't know. But there is a hope for Kimi to get in there in his own time, not when Toto says the time is right. Maybe Antonelli might flourish when the entire hierarchy could be turned upside down, but maybe let's just enjoy this year and next, yeah? Meanwhile, Checo isn't enjoying this year at all, with the world either awaiting his replacement or ignoring him. No good with last weekend when Curran vocally discussed a Max Daniel reunion of sorts right in front of the Mexican. Oh dear. Something of which I discuss more in this video here that you can go and watch right now. And even though Lawson doesn't seem as likely as he was last week, there's still a lot of jeopardy in the mix for Red Bull, and Checo, I hope he meets those targets. I really do.